Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in again after our somewhat awkward beginning last Wednesday, and then we paused for spring break, and now I'm doing a more typical kind of video check-in where I'll do the voiceover here, but we're actually looking at our course. So I'm in our due dates area, so we finished up our Unit 1, which had you doing looking through the orientation material in the course, doing a little orientation quiz. You'll notice that I've moved that down in our course menu now just to kind of get it out of the way since we passed it. Then within Unit 1, we also did a student homepage where you're kind of introducing yourself and posting a picture. Again, per my first announcement, that sort of helps us get that sense of community and actually being in a class. Hopefully makes you feel a little bit more engaged. Sometimes you find out some interesting similarities between you and your classmates as well, whether it's similar career path or similar major or transfer plans or similar educational background, maybe the same high school, maybe you've been out of school for a while, you know, just kind of that non-course, more personal kind of stuff. We also did what might have seemed like a little bit of a duplicate exercise using the discussion board tool where you introduced yourself again, responding to a little bit different questions, but also replying to other students. So the reason for that duplication is in large measure because the discussion board will be one of the main tools that we use throughout our course. And while many people have probably used them before in Blackboard here, others may not. So it's good, I think, useful for people to use that tool in a really low stakes kind of way. So you're just introducing yourself again, so it's not like a really complicated post that you've got to do. So again, you're just sort of learning the ins and outs of that particular tool in Blackboard, which, like I said, we'll use throughout the term. Grading for these early kinds of things is largely based just on the effort you put forward. I'm not grading based on, you know, the quality so-called of the writing at this point. We'll get to that a little bit later. In fact, one of the things that I wanted to point out before diving into Unit 2 and 3 a little bit is always, especially within our 8-week term, is to always revisit this due dates page. So of course you know that we have something coming up pretty soon, right? Tomorrow. I'm recording this on Monday. So end of the day, although notice again that our due dates are, for the discussion boards are a little bit different, where initial posts are due by noon, right? Replies due by the end of the day. Again, so that everybody isn't waiting until the last minute. So, you know, if you're trying to reply to someone, you're waiting and waiting. That's not very fair. So we have a kind of staggered due date system. But we're looking then at Tuesday, again, pretty quickly. But also you always want to be looking a little bit ahead so you know what's coming up. So we'll have that turnaround to Friday, and you'll notice we get on a pretty regular Tuesday-Friday schedule, basically until our first essay. But the other thing to note is that our first essay comes really like after halfway through our entire course. In fact, you'll notice that we turn around from our first essay right into our second, which is actually our last essay, and that sort of takes us to the end of our course. So the first basically half of our course, especially if you don't really count the introductions time, is this a series of scaffolding units where we're doing not a full-blown essay, but little pieces of what will appear in an essay. So we'll talk about like the shape of an essay here in Unit 3, a really core kind of fundamental principle for us. We'll look at things like thesis statements, how to do research, how to incorporate that research, how to cite correctly, how to build a works cited page, all of those pieces that we'll then put together in our first essay, which again doesn't come for quite a while. So for me, it doesn't make sense to assign an essay, let's say here in Unit 2 or even in Unit 3, if we haven't really covered the material that I'd be looking for. That would be like giving you the midterm in a history class in week 2, right? There'd be tons of stuff that we haven't even covered, so how is it fair to assess your knowledge of those things? So it might seem like a little kind of weird, but always keep in mind that we're piecing these things together to finally, right, build that whole essay once we get actually past the midterm in our course. So that's again another way of thinking about the way that our course works, really the way that any course should work, is that each assessment piece in any of the units, whether it's a discussion board, a quiz, a short writing assignment, whatever it happens to be, is testing your knowledge of whatever we've covered, right, up to that point. So it's not, sometimes writing can feel like this sort of mystical, you know, opaque thing where you do some stuff, but then you write an essay or an assignment, and you don't really know what you're supposed to be doing or how it's supposed to sound or what this professor's looking for. So I'm trying to remove that, that difficulty and make things as transparent as possible. So when we do an assignment, right, wherever it is, Unit 4 or down here at the essay, that is the assessment device. Is like taking a test where I get to see, have you done the work in the course, basically like gone to class, if you want to think of it that way. And you can now apply those concepts, those examples, those ideas in an actual assessment, whether it's just a paragraph or, like I said, a full-blown essay. So again, it's good to understand kind of the whole arc of our class, moving from basically Unit 2, where we are now, all the way to that first essay, and then turning around and producing that final essay. Okay. So we'll take a quick look at Unit 2 here. The other thing to keep in mind is that the grading is fairly straightforward and even fairly easy early on for the reasons that I just described, basically. So if we look at the fundamental question that's being asked in Unit 2 here, you're doing a little reading, responding to the reading. There's some requirements about, how to develop a good post, how to develop good replies. You can review that stuff in the grading guidelines area. There's pretty specific directions about what a really good post is versus just one that kind of, gets the job done but not much more. Same thing with replies. Of course, I notice, when Blackboard time codes everything. So if your post and replies are within about 8 minutes of each other, it doesn't show me that you've invested much time in it. That being said, though, because we haven't done a lot in our class, like how to cite correctly, for example. Many of you might know that from other classes already, but we haven't covered it here. So you can do quite well in like an early discussion board here, whether it's full points or like a 20 out of 25 or something like that, without necessarily getting all of that stuff correct, because like I said, we haven't really covered it yet. So you can sometimes get, that's sort of good, right? It's fair, I think, but it can also give you a sort of false sense of how well you're doing if you think, well, I got a really good grade in this early discussion board, so I just have to keep writing like that, including for the essay itself, and I'll get a great grade again. But remember, that's like, they're two different tests. They're two different assessment devices. So often the grading is, like I said, pretty straightforward early on, but of course it gets a little bit more complicated, a little more challenging as we do more in our course. So what you'll see in most of our units, again, is an objective laid out, pretty basic as we get underway here. Really important stuff about plagiarism. I'll return to this as we get closer to Essay 1, and particularly the final essay. But I don't think anybody really sets out intentionally to plagiarize in a course, or if they do, they're by far the minority, right? 1 out of 1,000 maybe students intentionally sets out to plagiarize and try to cheat the system. But what does happen, I think, a little bit more often is that once we get to those bigger point, the final essay, for example, and you've got a lot riding on it, you're just between a particular grade cutoff, you maybe haven't managed your time very well, and all of a sudden you get kind of boxed into a corner and you just sort of panic and make a bad decision. I think that's more often why or how plagiarism happens. So we're going to cover it early in our course here, so I can say that, yes, we've covered it, you know what it is, or should know what it is based on what we've done here. But again, it really doesn't apply for us, directly until we get sort of to the end of the course, and it's worth remembering just how sort of damaging plagiarism can be. So for our purposes, any plagiarism, is just an automatic F for the course. There's no leeway or leniency or, oh, you made a mistake, or, oh, we didn't cover that, or, oh, we didn't understand it. Obviously, if you have questions about it arising from Unit 2, you can be in touch with me, but truthfully, it's pretty straightforward. The other truth is that as easy as plagiarism has become, with Google to commit, it's just as easy to discover. In fact, there's some tools that are baked right into Blackboard that help any instructor discover plagiarized work. So, oftentimes Google will do a search and tell you how many seconds it spent doing that search, 0.03 or whatever it is now. That's like how long it takes to uncover cases of plagiarism. And like I said, it's sort of a zero tolerance policy. Any bit of plagiarism within your work is just an automatic F. Partly because it's just that serious, but also remember, this is 1102. It's the capstone, the end, especially once we get to that final essay, of the 1101, 1102 sequence, this is like, you know, the end of the end. So if you're plagiarizing there, that's just a serious problem. Okay, but we don't want to dwell on that too much, so we kind of cover it early. We put it out of the way. There's a really basic quiz here. Some literary terms. Our course focuses us obviously on writing is our fundamental focus, but we write about so-called literary works. That's kind of a loaded term, which is part of what we talk about in this unit here. But you'll see from our textbook that we're reading a series of short stories and then a play, and writing essays about them. It's I think it provides us a really good thing to write about. There's lots of good research designed specifically for students doing a course like this, which we'll get into in later units. It's a nice little contained sort of world. Oftentimes students will be writing about, if not the exact same story, then at least the same type of essay, so you don't have one person doing, you know, performance-enhancing drugs and somebody else is doing something about politics, and it just sort of like all scattered all over the map. Certainly those courses can work, but our focus is literature, at least in terms of what we read. Fundamentally, though, this is a writing class, so we're concerned with the composition aspect of everything. But a little review of literary terms, again, mostly for your reference, nothing that you have to hand in to me directly, and then a basic quiz. Like most of the quizzes that we do, it's fairly low point value. You'll notice that in many cases you can do it multiple times. You can have the resources open in front of you. It's not like this is a really like hermetically sealed test that you've got to do. The point isn't that you memorize a bunch of stuff. The point for these quizzes is that you just sort of recognize important terms or important ideas, like with the plagiarism stuff. Clearly we care more about the writing, which is what we do in our discussion board here. So again, I'm looking for really well developed initial posts. That means that of course you follow the directions here, but you also reflect the grading guidelines here. So you're developing your own idea, you're quoting multiple times from the work that we've read, ideally from the work itself, not from one of the ancillary quotes, like the quotes within the document, like from other authors. We're trying to quote from the author here, Kelly J. Mays, who's the editor of our textbook. So you have your own ideas, you're quoting from the text, maybe you're drawing some other things in as well. So a really, really good post is pulling all of these different threads together. The same thing kind of happens with a reply. You're responding to what somebody else has posted, but in depth. So you're quoting that post directly, you're developing your own ideas, you're probably quoting the reading again, and again, that's like the ideal. So you're pulling all of these threads and kind of weaving them together. In fact, the word text and textile, like a woven piece of material, are related, so we can keep that in mind as a little memory device, if you like. We're not so concerned with MLA citation here, so don't worry about that. Again, we haven't covered it, so it's not something that I'm going to test you on or grade you up or down for. And the last thing I'll say here is that as we get into the course, you'll notice that you know, you might get, let's say, if a discussion board is out of 50, maybe you get 40 or 45. If you translate that into a percent and then a grade, it can seem like that 5-point difference is the difference between a B and an A, or why didn't I get an A, or what's the reason for this grade. Try to avoid that type of thinking. Always just think in terms of the raw point value. So the whole course is out of 1,000. So if you're getting 40 out of 50, you haven't done terrific, right? You haven't produced that ideal post, but really, you know, that the 5 points between the so-called B and the A in the overall scheme of 1,000 is really not going to make that big of a difference. So if you're getting 40, you've probably done basically the requirements. It's not stellar, but you've completed it. If you've really gone above and beyond, that's when you're looking at like a 45 or rarely a 50. I mean, with writing, it's hard to get the perfect grade, but certainly you can get an A by going a little bit above and beyond just fulfilling the requirements. But again, if you get all hung up on, oh no, I got a B, you really didn't get a B. I mean, only in the mathematical sense. Really, you got, you know, about 5 points away from an A, 5 points out of 1,000. So always keep the raw point value in mind in terms of our larger class out of 1,000 points. It'll totally de-stress as we go through. You're thinking about, oh, I keep getting B's on this. Well, not really. I mean, again, mathematically, but not in the overall scheme of things. As you'll see from our grading guidelines, the bulk of the points really come in our essays, which makes sense for a course like ours, right? So essay 1, and then in that final essay, once we get right down to the end of our course, that's where, you know, most of the points are coming in our course. Okay, so as we get rolling for real now, if you have any questions or concerns, by all means be in touch with me, and I look forward to seeing what everyone has to say about this idea of literature, quote unquote, in Unit 2.